Hi, I'm Angela. I have a husband with bipolar 2 disorder, my kids have ADHD, and I myself have struggled with depression. You're not alone.
Okay, this year has really been unprecedented in the isolation that all of us have experienced. And also, what it has led to is just a lot of loneliness and a disconnect in a lot of our relationships. So, today we're going to talk about why that happens and really what we can do about it. I'm so excited to have Reverend Jeremiah Peck with us today. And he is a licensed mental health counselor and also a professor of counseling at Multnomah University. Thank you for being here, Jeremiah.
Yes, thank you, Angela, for having me.
Yeah, well, let's jump right into talking about this. Can you share with me why you think there is just such a loss of relationships that contribute to this experience of loneliness that we're going through?
Yes, certainly. And so much of the literature and research, even right now, given that most of us this year are in the midst of experiencing this as it happens,
Right.
some of the articles and literature is really discussing how folks are experiencing intense polarization,
Mm.
whether that's attributed to political matters or matters of health and safety and wellness, or even varying perspectives as to how to respond to the various challenges that this year has faced. Folks are really under a lot of stress and a lot of really intense emotions like fear and worry and anxiety. And those stress responses mixed with that polarized experience really been damaging to many secure relationships, to many long-term relationships that folks are now also experiencing the grief and loss that
Yeah.
comes with having lost some of these intimate connections.
Yeah, so it's not just I have to stay at home or I'm experiencing a different type of work schedule because I'm not interacting with people at work, but it's also the that intimacy that you're normally experiencing with your connections with people, where you would feel like people get you and they understand what you're going through, and then with this polarization, that's not happening. And so that can really make it more profound, I think. And so that's what's leading to a lot more anxiety in people's lives, I think, through that loneliness and isolation.
Yes, that's exactly right. There's the physical component that, in many contexts, physical interactions and seeing people in person has been impacted this year. But then substitute that where many relational interactions then take place over a digital platform or even over
Right.
social media, and how social media can be so inundated with intense polarized responses as well that aren't
Mm.
relationally conducive. So folks are not only experiencing the relational setback in a lack of connection, but then also that relational setback in intense arguing, disagreeing over impersonal platforms.
Right, which they probably wouldn't necessarily have gotten into those type of, discussions if they were in person with their friends or family, or maybe they would have been more diplomatic about their ways of expressing themselves. That buffer of the screen kind of tends to make people more bold. So that definitely contributes to it. So this loss of relationship kind of contributing to this experience of loneliness. You had touched on it. You said that there's almost like a grief that happens, and that the undealt with grief often leads to depression. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. There's some misconceptions and myths about grief that we only grieve tangible losses,
Uh-huh.
like when we lose something, physical, or when we would grieve a person, it means that that person's no longer around. And
Mm.
while that certainly is one way in which we experience grief over tangible things,
Right.
there's also an intangible element over loss and grief as well, that we can lose non-physical things like losing a friendship or losing a relationship, or even losing something like emotional and relational about the loss of companionship or the loss of the security that certain relationships give us. All of those losses are also valuable lived experiences, and as such, contribute to that feeling of grief and sadness. That's something that we once had has been impacted and affected this year.
Yeah, I think that that tends to lead toward, almost like a negative outlook on life because it's just like loss after loss of these intimate relationships. And then that is very difficult, especially if you're not finding a place to deal with that grief. And I'd like to see if you could kind of talk to us about, if we ourselves or someone that we know, is dealing with grief and loneliness, like how do you identify that? What does that even look like?
Yeah, and that's such a great question because so many folks right now may be grieving or may be experiencing intense sadness, as you were mentioning, or even intense stress, and might not have the tools to recognize why or how that's impacting them.
Right.
There's many physiological as well as behavioral components that, if we're in tune and if we know what to look for, we can identify and see these patterns in our own behavior. And some of those physiological aspects of how we're sleeping, and if we're experiencing insomnia or hypersomnia, even if there's any
Mhm.
disruptions to someone's sleep cycle,
Okay.
difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up not feeling rested,
Mhm.
those things can be indicative of intense stress and distress, also consistent with some depressive features as well.
Right.
And there's also some behavioral components. We're hearing from a lot of folks, even in a clinical space, that uncharacteristically, folks are finding themselves much more irritable or
Mhm.
forgetful, or
Yeah.
having difficulty concentrating, things of that nature.
Right.
And another one that I want to really draw our focus and attention to are the risk of substance abuse and leaning on unhealthy or maladaptive coping skills
Mhm.
as a means of dealing with the intense stress or loneliness that folks are experiencing right now.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point that when you find yourself doing things that are not your usual response, that is a red flag to a family member watching that. And then also, even for yourself, that's not your usual response to be so on edge where you're right at the breaking point when one little thing happens.
Mhm.
That's not you. And so what can you do to be proactive to say like I don't want to continue on in this behavior. There must be, something that I can do to kind of start dealing with some of this grief that I'm feeling without um, you know really just taking it out on all of my loved ones, because this is the impact that happens, even if you're using substances as a form of coping, then that's not only impacting you, that's impacting all of your loved ones. And I don't think that's the intent,
Mm.
when people are using these coping skills that maybe when they're in pain, they, everyone uses something to cope. And so, that's the cycle that happens. But, what can someone do to really address these feelings so that they don't feel like, okay, the world stage is out of my control. I can't, necessarily impact that in a way of making it stop, or although we can definitely pray and do that kind of impact in the world. But what can I do to really address these feelings that I'm having so that I can make a difference in my life and the lives of those around me?
Yeah, and that's really an excellent point and question. So well stated that it's often when we can observe those changes from what's normative for us. It can be as simple, Angela, as someone acknowledging and being aware
Mhm.
that they've been less patient than they normally would be recently.
Right.
And I bring that up as a sort of first tool and tip just as a helpful resource and skill to implement, is this acknowledging and awareness piece.
Right.
That if folks are better able to be aware of what it is they're feeling and acknowledge, right now I'm feeling lonely, or right now I'm grieving, and looking at the underlying emotions that might be driving more of the surface emotions like anger or frustration or irritability. That's a tremendous first step in reconciling and coping with, in a positive way, the intense side effects or repercussions of the challenges that this year has faced. I'd like to list off a few others, in
Yeah,
addition to
definitely.
the acknowledging and awareness piece.
Yeah. So first acknowledgement, awareness. If we don't have self-awareness, then it's pretty hard to even bring that up with a loved one that, hey, I know what's going on here. That's
Yeah,
yeah. So what else would you say?
yeah. So much right now, it's really been accentuated, the importance of what we call self-care. And sometimes there are some misconceptions even about self-care, but the way I like to share it with folks is treating yourself like you treated someone else, of the basic graciousness that you would extend to someone, how you'd be kind to them, how you'd be listening to them, how you'd recommend that someone else takes care of themselves. It's extending those same graces to you.
Right.
So you're being mindful of getting enough rest. You're being
Yes.
mindful about your own healthy exercise and diet. You're also taking enough time for recreation, for play, for times where you can have enjoyment, and you're investing in your wellness. That's
That's
so
really
important and so critical during times like these.
right. And I think that when there's such serious topics all the time, before us, that we forget that we're not like superhuman. We can't handle that amount of pressure all the time, right? And so to even say it's okay to like turn off all the noise and, to play a game with your family or go for a walk and just, shut it all out, those are things that are going to help you not only in your relationships, but also for yourself, just to maintain, good, healthy, boundaries in your life, but also, healthy mental health.
Yes, and I so appreciated that slowing down, and you use the phrase cutting out noise.
Mhm.
Another helpful strategy for folks is practicing being present. Practicing one word that's used a lot right now is practicing being mindful. How I like to share that with folks is this idea of monotasking. We've all heard of multitasking, doing multiple things at the same
Right.
time.
Yeah, we're all guilty of that.
Yes, monotasking is just doing one thing at a time. And this may seem so simple, and
Mhm.
yet how many of us are guilty of dividing our attention, whether that's while we're eating a meal, we're also listening to a podcast, or we're also responding to emails. And we have
Yeah.
these divided attentions that during times of intense stress and distress can contribute to the cultural hypervigilance that keeps
Mhm.
us at these elevated states. So, practicing mindfulness or monotasking, simply doing one thing at a time, can
Mhm.
help our brains and our bodies regulate better, because it breaks us of that hypervigilance that comes with stress and distress.
Right. And we don't realize the amount of stress that our bodies are under just from what's going on in the world. So there's already that heightened situation. And then whatever's happening in our own personal lives and, work or whatever, it's a lot to really expect of ourselves. I think, um, you know, when we kind of have this high expectation that we should be able to handle it. It's like this is something we've never been through before. Like you said, be gracious to yourself as you would to someone else. We might not be able to be as productive, every day of the week as we would expect ourselves to be, or as we were in 2019. And maybe we have a day where we're amazing. And then the next day, wow, I'm not so amazing today. What would you say to a friend who said that to you?
Right. And
I think that's a great way of looking at it.
yeah, there's a graciousness in our own internal dialogue where we may be more inclined to be supportive of others, but how often do we hear folks or even say the phrase to ourselves things like I'm my own worst critic,
Mm.
or I'm really hard on myself. And really that's code for negative self-talk,
Yeah.
which might be reflective, as you mentioned, Angela, of getting saturated with such negativity and
Right.
stress, even in the media that we consume,
Exactly.
that can give us a propensity towards that negativity being internalized oftentimes as well.
Yeah, and I'd really like to encourage people to reach out for help if they feel like they are, not able to handle it on their own. And that's totally normal and expected really during this time. Counselors are a great resource for that. What would you say would be kind of a sign that, hey, it's time to reach out for a counselor? This would be, some signs for that.
Yeah. As you mentioned, anytime you're noticing some of that isolation or some of the behavioral manifestations of this, you're saying, I've just been more frustrated than I'm used to feeling, or I've been having these emotional bouts of sadness, or I've had difficulty sleeping due to racing thoughts or anxieties or fears and worries. Just reaching out, planning a time to sit down with someone or a counselor and talk about all the intense thoughts and feelings that you're holding has really been, I've seen, be a great, tremendous first step for folks
Right.
to mitigating and reconciling the intensity of the challenges that so many of us have been facing this year.
Yeah, that's so true. And I'll say this every time that not everyone has a mental illness, but everyone needs to take care of their mental health. Thank you so much for being here today, Jeremiah. We know that God is our ever present help in time of trouble, that we don't have to fear because He is always with us. So if you're struggling today, reach out for help for a counselor, but also reach out to God. He is there with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Bye bye.
And a big thank you to His Heart for supporting this channel. If you want more information for you and those you love on mental health, go to mentalhealth.academy today.